Hello, change makers and social innovators across Africa and the globe. We welcome you to another amazing edition of the IHA Social Impact Webinar in 2022. If you are joining us from any part of the globe, we would love to read from you. So kindly share in the comment section your location and as well as your name. So I am Tony Banjo and I am the host of this amazing webinar. And we already have in the studio our quintessential guest speaker, Barrister Edem Ossai. And I'm so excited to have her come on board very soon. But in the midst of that, we want to hear from everyone joining us this evening. So type in the comment section your location, where you're joining us from across the globe. We would love to read from you. Indeed, this year has gotten onto a very great start. This marks our first edition of the Social Impact webinar in 2022, and we have so much more in store for you. Based on the curated feedback from all of our attendees, we will be treating a lot of very important topics month in, month out. So quickly share in the comment section. We want to read from each of you where you're joining us from. If you're joining from any part of Nigeria, share your name, share what you do, as well as your location. So we'd love to read from each of you. I can see that there are a lot of people already on board. So thank you, Oluwatosin Ruth. Good evening. Where are you joining us from, Ruth? I know you're probably joining us from Lagos. Thank you for joining. We also want to read from every other person on board right now. So type in the comment section. Let us hear from you. Tell us where you're joining us from. Any part of the globe, if you're joining us from Africa, from South Africa, from East Africa, whether Kenya, whether Ghana, whether from the Asia continent, whether China, any part of the globe, just type in the comment section and we would love to read from you. Thank you so much, Kende Ellen. Thank you for joining us. Good evening to you. Yes, we're so glad reading from you as well. I'll take one more person just before I move on to introduce our guest speaker. She's super prepared for us. She's ready, prepped, and ready to really take us on a very great ride through the session. All right, good evening, or I don't know what time it is at your end, Amanda, but I can see that you're joining us from North Carolina in USA. It's so great reading from you, Amanda Offord. Thank you for joining us this evening. All right, so let me quickly move on to, in a grand style, welcome our guest speaker. So we will kick off with a quick unveiling of our profile. Barrister Edem Dorothy Ossai is a lawyer with over 15 years working in child rights advocacy and the education sector. She is the founder and current director of Mayin, a nonprofit based in Nigeria, working to advance young people's development through equity in education, entrepreneurship development, and practical civic engagement, ensuring the girls are not left behind. In 2021, our organization, Mayin, gained special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council and has since been an active participant in ECOSOC meetings and the UN General Assembly. In 2018, Adam initiated Girls Without Borders, a school club based program that teaches adolescent girls about their rights and how to exercise their own agency. As a result of her work in girls' education and agency, she was appointed as Echidon Global Scholar in 2021 by the Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C., and has since published several resources, including a policy brief on gender responsive education in emergencies in Nigeria. Presently serving as a country consultant for the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies in Nigeria, Edem holds a master's degree in international development and policy from the University of Chicago, where she was selected as an inaugural Obama Foundation Scholar. She also holds a first master's degree in cultural and media studies from the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, and a certificate in new media and citizens journalism from Helen Getty School of Citizen Journalism, Israel. In 2016, Adam was appointed a Mandela Washington Fellow by the U.S. State Department, during which she undertook a civic leadership exchange program at the School of Public Service and Community Solutions at Arizona State University. A recipient of several awards for her work in education and gender equality, including the African American Institute Peach First Prize at the State of Education in Africa Conference, Lagos, Nigeria in 2015, and the Commonwealth Women in Leadership Prize, 10th Women Affairs Ministers Meeting, Dhaka, Bangladesh in 2013. Edem currently serves on the board of various organizations, including the Initiative for Arts and Cultural Development, an active citizen from 2017 to 2018. She also serves as the Oyo State Youth Leader for the now defunct COA political party in Nigeria, and she intends to contest for a seat in Nigeria's legislature in the near future. With a warm and resounding applause, I want us to welcome on board Barrister Edem Ossai as she takes us on the topic designing your nonprofit organization and social enterprises for global impact and advocacy. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. So pleased, and we're super pleased to have you on board this evening.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that introduction, and a warm evening to everyone who's joining the program. A special shout out to my friend Amanda. Thanks, Amanda, for joining in. Thanks always for the moral support. Yeah, Amanda's joining in from North Carolina. I appreciate it. And to everyone, again, I appreciate your presence, and I hope that together we can learn something useful that will improve your work and, improve your impact. So I again want to thank the organizers represented by Tony for inviting me to share on the topic designing your nonprofit and social enterprise strategies for global impact and advocacy. I apologize, I'm not feeling very well, but I'll do my best to deliver. Usually I'm more vibrant than this, but nevertheless, let's see how we can make sense of the slides tonight. Just to put a caveat, the slides I'll be sharing are part of the resources built while I was a scholar at the Kinder Global Scholar at Brookings at the Center for Universal Education. And so all resources created belong to the Center for Universal Education. So I'm leveraging those resources now today because having worked with them, they own that IP, whether or not I created it. Anyway, so let's share on this important topic. A subtitle that was stated was that the purpose is to help us to effectively strategize and plan advocacy campaigns that can achieve global impact. And I think that's a very tall order. That's quite an ambitious goal. So I'd like to share with you 7 principles that I do believe are best practices, and you will find them effective if you employ them. Tony, you're fine. The third slide is fine. Yes, here. I sort of reframed the topic because looking at it, I think essentially what we're discussing is how do we expand our impact pathways? How do we, reach the audience we want to reach and achieve the impact we desire to achieve? So it means many things to different people. If you're working in the policy-making space, you're probably using policy as an instrument to achieve your impact. For those of us in a nonprofit space, we do a lot of advocacy, we do a lot of programmatic interventions. So sometimes you're designing an advocacy campaign, sometimes it's a real program you're implementing on the ground for some target group of people. Whatever it is, there's certain outcomes that you've targeted and you want to accomplish. How do we make sure that you do achieve those, outcomes you set out to achieve? How do we make sure that you can scale, that your work is meaningful, it's enduring, your impact is tangible, it's felt, and can reach many more people. The focus today will be on advocacy because that's the topic I've been asked to talk about. So we'll narrow this to advocacy. Whatever issues you zoom in your work, whether it's environmental issues, whether it's gender-based issues, whether it's education, like I work in education, whether it's children's rights, whether it's sustainable buildings, whatever it is, your goal is to expand your impact pathways. And I hope that with today's presentation, you'll be better positioned to do that, to do just that. Next slide, please. So like I said, you can fill in the gap here. For the purpose of today's presentation, our focus is on advocacy. But for many people, it could be many things. And many of us wear several hats. So some people, yes, you're in a nonprofit or you run a nonprofit or you work in a nonprofit, but perhaps you're also doing other things. Maybe you're also, in the public sector. Maybe you work in the public sector doing one thing or the other. Maybe you're a private sector individual and you award grants. Maybe you donate to NGOs. And so you can fill in that gap, expanding our impact in evidence-based policymaking. For you, it might be expanding your impact in evidence-based advocacy. It might be expanding your impact in evidence-based grant making. Like I said, some of you are in the business of supporting local NGOs. You make donations. We look for people like you, local philanthropy. Some of you are actually even awarding large-size grants. Some of you work for organizations that award grants. How do you make sure that your grants are more meaningful? They really affect the development landscape. How do we make sure that the humanitarian landscape is shaped by the work that you do, that you're achieving more impact and that it's evidence-based? I think the fulcrum of our work rests on four pillars. Essentially, we're in a dispensation where the focus is on evidence-based work. Don't just conjecture. We have to take it a step. We're all, enjoined these days when we're in development work to make sure that our interventions stem from real evidence, real active, concrete evidence gathered from the ground, not anecdotes, not stories, not observations, because too often when we go into the work, it's because of maybe a personal experience we had, or we observed something in our community. But you have to take it a step further. Those things you observe and those things you experience should lead you to go and delve into deeper research, to make inquiries, to find out what exists at a population level. At a wider level of your community, what are the trends? What are the patterns you find? So that's why we say the work begins with research. And you don't have to be a researcher in an academic institution. You don't have to be a PhD or a lecturer or professor in the university before you employ research. Everybody, to some extent is a researcher. When you ask questions, when you have a focus group, when you make inquiries, you're researching, you're trying to find out, the experiences of other people in that same environment. You want to build your decision-making based on the information you've gathered from other people, not just yourself, so that you are sure that there is a problem. You're sure that you understand the problem. You're sure of how wide this, or to what extent this problem affects how many people. What are the dynamics, histories, and all of that? So that's why we say it starts with research. It starts with making inquiries. It starts with finding out what is the situation on the ground. Do your needs assessment. They call it different things in development work. You call it your problem tree analysis. You call it your context, what is your context assessment or context analysis? What is your needs assessment? There's so many terminologies for it. We're basically asking the same question. What have you done to find out what exists? And then when you do all those things, you apply all those methodologies, all those methods to acquire information from a wide sample, and there are many ways to do it. Like I hinted, I said, for us in the NGO world, we do a lot of focus groups. You do a lot of, baseline assessments. You give out forms, surveys, those forms that people fill. You have one-on-one interviews. These are all methods of collecting information. You do your desk literature, you sit down, you study reports, you read reports of people who have gone on the field and done that data collection for you and analyzed it. You read the newspapers, You collect information about policies that have been passed, things like that. When you do all of that, then you build the evidence. That's what we call your evidence. So you gather your evidence. It's from your evidence you spring to action. Your action, derives out of your evidence. Any set of series of actions or steps you take that don't stem from concrete evidence are already, dead on arrival. Or at best, maybe by some fluke, it will just happen on some outcomes that, but you can't sustain those outcomes because they don't derive from concrete evidence. So that's why it's very critical. And I'll be hampering on this a lot in the course of this presentation. You have to be somebody who is sensitive and, responsible enough to collect evidence. Do your reporting, it's critical. And then from action, we begin to record impact. And you collect your impact, you report your impact, you share your impact stories, you communicate your impact to policymakers, again, to your donors, to your partners, to your board members, the whole spectrum, right? But you communicate your impact because that impact is further evidence that your intervention works. Your theory of change is, accurate, that sort of thing. Next slide. So in all of these things, again, remember, the whole purpose is how do we design? We're talking about designing my nonprofit and my social enterprise so that I can run effective advocacy strategies and achieve global impact through an advocacy campaign. That's the goal, right? You have to understand that stakeholders play key roles and very different roles in relation to the issues you work on. And there are different kinds of stakeholders, but you have to identify them. One of the first steps you need to take when you are working on specific issues, any kind of issue at all, is to recognize the arena you're playing in, to analyze it very, keenly, very carefully, to assess your playing field, your environment, your context. Who are the people who have or who are affected or who can affect the issue? It's very important. You have to map it. So you hear a lot of terms in development world or development work where they say mapping your stakeholders, stakeholder mapping. And all kinds of consultants will come with different approaches to it. Principally, you must know how to do it. You have to be able to do it. You can't do the work without doing it. And this is not something you do once when you're starting your nonprofit and then you forget it and you don't revisit it. No, you keep reviewing your stakeholder map because the landscape is constantly shifting. It's always evolving. The landscape of education in Nigeria 5 years ago is radically different today. There are probably more maybe private, in academic institutions operating today. The situation of teachers has changed dramatically. COVID has affected the, playing ground as well. The availability of the internet and its resources has, created a situation of learning beyond the classroom. So all of these dynamics are playing. And so if I am working in that space, I have to recognize who my stakeholders are. I have to keep mapping. I have to recognize when, for instance, donors are standing by to push education, online educational resources to disadvantaged children in the most underserved communities. Maybe 10 years ago, they were not there, but suddenly they're there because the internet exists, right? So I have to understand that my stakeholder map 10 years when I started in 2011 or 2012, it's not the same map I need to function with in 2022. So you have to keep doing your mapping. And when you're mapping, I mean, this is a simple sort of rubric you can follow. Who are the decision makers? Because in every space, there are people who are making decisions that affect you and I. Here in this setting, they're typically policymakers, they're typically public officials, appointed, elected, government officials, they're regulators, they're people working in the ministries of education, there are people working in agencies, for education like SUBEB, and I'm narrowing this to my own space, mostly education. So whatever your own, field, the field of your issue is, you have to identify your decision makers. What committee was recently set up, for instance, to, issue licenses to all maybe companies that are in the alternative energy space? These are things you might need to know. what, agency is responsible for monitoring carbon emissions, or, monitoring activities of um, schools with respect to maybe safeguarding. Think of your issue. Who are the people responsible to make a decision that affects you? Identify all of them. Identify all of them. You also need to be very sensitive to your resource people, the people who, you know, sign the checks or have the are the gateways to those resources. Sometimes your resources are not just money. Sometimes your community is a resource. You have to leverage them as well. So you might identify vast resources in uncanny places. But you need to be very, that's why the exercises like this, they're not a one-day exercise. Literally, some people spend a full week of retreats in companies or NGOs just mapping stakeholders. So that's why I said this is a very simplistic, rubric or image. You can expand this further, and you can spend days just on one specific item, mapping, pointing out who's working in this space, who is in this community, who is the key decision maker in Oyo State, in Lagos State, in Southwest Nigeria, in the country, in at the level of the African Union or at the level of ECOWAS. So think of your regional, even your regional, multilateral institutions, your global multilateral institutions, and then you begin to map who makes any decisions. Africa Vision 2063, who are the decision makers over issues regarding gender? Or the directorate, the Women's Development and Gender Directorate. You have to map. So you have to research even to identify all your stakeholders under a specific pillar. So again, resource people. Resource people could be directly, people providing funding resources, could be people that have access to technical resources. Sometimes the resources you need are understanding of tools, access to tools. Sometimes you need access to certain software, certain, trainings. Those might be your resources. You also need to map your influencers and your champions, people who, look, if you have them on board, they open doors for you. Building strategic alliances with these kinds of groups of people are very relevant to your cause. You have to map them out. If you're working with young people, for instance, who are the influencers over the minds of young people? Who are the people where, if you just, that's why you see a lot of people using celebrities, for brand ambassadors and things like that. You see global citizens, you see One World. Think of all the, international NGOs that are very active in terms of running advocacy campaigns. One World comes to mind. Global Citizen comes to mind. They keep using, icons, movie makers, top musicians that the world, everybody recognizes, because they know that these people arrest our attention. That if they put a Leonardo DiCaprio, to talk about the environment, that he'll have the attention of young people and he might shift their, he might be able to convince them, or, by the time he says something, he will sway their thinking in that direction. Or they pick a popular, musician, or they get a Beyonce to stand behind a certain message and promote a message. That's why people do things like that. So you might need to leverage those principles even at local level. You might need to find, who's the local actor, who is the popular musician, who is the popular Fuji musician, who's the, very well loved actress, who's the, comedian, who's the I don't know, community hero, somebody that the community really hero worships or just respects and holds in high esteem. You leverage those kinds of people. Whether it's position people who just occupy positions, and by virtue of those positions, they have a vast audience. And so if they say something, it reaches a wide audience, or it reaches a large population of people. You leverage those kinds of things. So these are things you need to do when you're doing your stakeholder mapping. These are critical things you must do when you want to build any advocacy campaign. And of course, gatekeepers. Gatekeepers is a term you are probably familiar with, or you should be. Again, in development work, we're not speaking about the literal gate man or gate woman that you're familiar with, but we recognize that to gain access into any community, any community at all, whether it's a virtual community, whether it's community of place, community of, interest, community of practice, there is a gatekeeper. There is somebody who must give you access. There's somebody who must approve your coming in. We call these people gatekeepers. If I want to do work in a school, who are my gatekeepers? I must first approach the Ministry of Education to grant me approval to go and work with the school principal. Because if I go without a letter approving my entry, the principal will say, no, you can't come in. That makes the Ministry of Education a gatekeeper. If I want to work with school children in their schools, can I just enter their school compound and begin to do my work? No. Not because I can literally enter once I just tell the gate man, oh, I'm here to do something. Oh, I'm here to see the principal. I'm here to see a teacher. Yes, I'll walk in. But can I run my intervention? I can't until I have certain people's approvals. So in any space where you're functioning, you must identify who are the people whose approvals you need to obtain first before you can function. In the Niger Delta, when you want to run any intervention at all, they always train us. Apart from the local chiefs, you have to consult and engage and seek the approvals and permissions of the local traditional rulers. You must also approach the youth in the communities there. And then they have what they call the CDCs, the Community Development Committees. You must approach them. You must approach them. If you go to certain communities, that's their own structure. So depending on what you want to do and where you want to do it, they're always invisible gatekeepers. Identify them and gain their, engage them and gain their permissions or approvals. So these are stakeholders you have to be mindful of. Next slide. No, sorry. Go back. You were fine. Yes. And just to help you further, when you are doing your stakeholder mapping, certain key questions you have to ask, because this will move you from just mapping your stakeholder to designing or plotting or preparing your strategy of working with them, or how to effectively engage them to get the outcomes you want. Remember, for every stakeholder, there's something you want from that person. Either you want them to approve something, either you want them to pass a policy, whether you want them to outlaw something, or you want them to, there's always something you want a key stakeholder to do, or to release funds for something, to allocate resources for something. Now, when you've mapped them, that's the beginning question we have here. I said, who are the key stakeholders? You have to recognize, the key ones, the ones without whom your actions can't see the light of day. And when you have them on your side, you have higher chances of achieving your outcomes or the purposes you're seeking to achieve. That's what we call key stakeholders. They're key, they're pivotal, they're important, they're critical, right? When you've done that, you now need to understand your stakeholders. What motivates them? Sometimes I always have situations, for instance, at work. As a nonprofit executive, I'm constantly writing fundraising letters, right? And you're targeting different people. So usually there's something that always happens, and I'll give this as an example. When I tell some of my team members, oh, write fundraising or sponsorship letters to corporate organizations, they'll just use, there's something we always use generically. We state it, we say, as part of your corporate social responsibility, we hereby invite you to do so, 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 and so. And not only is that such a redundant term, it also is, for lack of a better word, it's disingenuous. It's not creative. It's not creative at all. It's lazy. I consider it a very lazy, approach to engaging a stakeholder just as part of your corporate social responsibility. And I find that a lot of young people do it a lot, especially new people working, young people working, joining the workforce for the first time. Some people have been in employment for a long time and they're still that disingenuous. You have to be somebody who is not lazy. Like I said, this thing stems from research. If you notice, on the left side, you keep seeing the same thing. So just as you're researching your mission statement, researching your problem statement, you're also researching your stakeholder map. Everything that requires when you want to be effective at anything, you have to have done your homework. Your homework implies that you have to have dug into the information archives to get concrete information. Information is power. So if, for instance, I want to motivate, I want to talk to a sponsor in a way that is compelling, I have to hit at their own desires too. That letter must strike an emotional chord for them. If I'm able to tell a company, oh, we noticed in your first year or Q1 report or in your end of year report for last year, you indicated that your top 2 goals or top 3 goals for this next year's business year are as follows. And on the third one, you mentioned that strengthening community engagement by supporting maybe visually impaired communities. Then you are very specific to what the company has already identified as its own mission or objective for that next year. And you are aligning your request with that specific mission of that organization. That's born out of research. So I tell people, don't just approach a stakeholder and just use generic statements. No, you have to really find out what's that person, what's that person's expectation for the next level of their life? What's that person's own focus? What's that person's current ambition? What's that person's current mission, current goal statement? Because the more you align your request or whatever it is you want to achieve with that hoped for desire or that desired outcome that other person too is seeking, the more likely you are to receive the outcome you want or to get the yes you're hoping to get. If, for instance, as maybe I'm an investor and I tell myself this year, my focus is on supporting 50 young business entrepreneurs who are in rice farming. Rice farming. I want to support 50 young women in Oyo State who are in rice farming to accelerate their farming businesses. And then somebody comes to me and says, oh, our NGO is working to support, women empowerment by helping them make bags. We're also working with, school boys to teach them how to be part of the green economy through installation of solar panels. And a third NGO comes to me and says, we're supporting women empowerment in Ibarapa local government in Oyo State. And we're working at the moment with 200 young women in the area of rice farming. Which of these three am I likely to give my money to? It is the one who is closest to my own goal statement for the year. So when you are mapping your stakeholders are not just robots who exist without desires and dreams and ambitions. No, whether it's a company has missions too. A company has objectives spelled out for the year. You're very likely to hit, the goal you want to when you are hitting at the heart of what that company also wants to achieve. So do your homework, go and research your stakeholders. What motivates your stakeholders to take action? Somebody may have decided that it is going to be his legacy in the National Assembly to be the first person to pass the gender pro-equality bills. You must find that kind of lawmaker. That's the lawmaker that is most likely to be friendly towards gender equality bills and whatever. But if you keep running around in circles and not reaching the right people, you keep hearing no, and frustration will set in. So sometimes it's all about zooming in, honing in. Sometimes I tell people it takes 90% more effort to do the research and just 10% to launch your arrow. So a lot of people spend a lot of time launching their arrows, but they've not spent 90% of their effort doing the research. So do your research, it's very important. When you now identify what motivates your stakeholders, you have to also sit down critically and think, what is the evidence I must present that will make them move? What is the evidence I'm going to present? So imagine a person who approached me, the investor who wants to support young women in rice farming. And that person shows me a letter. And that person shows me a nice visual report of their last year's, impact report summary, showing me 20 young women farmers who were empowered. And that person even comes with a YouTube video or some nice short documentary showing me the testimonials of these women. The women are saying, oh, I participated in this empowerment program by this organization. And not only did they help my rice farm to be more sustainable, to survive the COVID period, to do this, that. My rice farm has now scaled from a production capacity of so tons of rice per year to so metric tons of rice now in this new year. Is it not the video documentary that is likely to move any of us listening to action? So sometimes you have to be very strategic. What kind of format will you present your information in? What evidence do they need to see? Some people need to see evidence that you've gone around so many schools and you've collected a report of the situation of libraries in 50 public schools. Some people just, maybe if you just tell them, oh, I visited the library and I read, or I read newspapers throughout the year showing me the situation of libraries. But imagine if you go around schools on an audit exercise, or and you're capturing images of libraries or non-existent, or you're going visiting and interviewing school principals, school students, and teachers to ask them, what does it mean to not have a library in your school? How does it impact you? And you gather all that into evidence. It's different from the person that just says, I have a newspaper. After reading several reports, I've been able to establish that in the 50 schools visited in so and so, they don't have libraries. But the person that is able to tell me that, after speaking with 200 students, I have seen that the absence of libraries directly affects students' abilities to succeed academically, to explore and exploit resources or opportunities on the internet through e-resources. It affects teachers because teachers cannot research their lesson plans before coming to the classroom. Unfortunately, school principals are also in despair because the situation of school performance is worsening. Students don't have extracurricular spaces to go to, and so they engage in gang activities, street fighting, and all of that. And school principals are, blaming this on the absence of libraries. I tell you, anybody who hears that human story will be more likely to be moved to act. A policymaker who hears these different, angles of the story is more likely to be compelled to act than if you just say a visit to 50 libraries indicated that the situation is terrible, school children don't have access to libraries. But if that same policymaker is shown the evidence of the lack of libraries, the impact that this is recording in the life of his community, he's more likely to take those concrete steps. So these are the things you need to do. What is the evidence you have to collect that will move them to action? Is it enough to just tell them the status quo? Is it enough to just tell them what exists? Should you dig further to tell them the impact of the status quo? Since this situation began, or since this pattern emerged, or since this trend, we started recording this trend, these are the effects that have been felt in the community. Women are dying. Maternal mortality rates have shot up. Child mortality rates have worsened. Lifespan, low lifespan. The community is recording, so you begin to tell them what this means in the life of a community. So sometimes you have to even be very strategic. What kind of evidence will move the needle? And then how do you engage? This is something we need to recognize. Sometimes in the nonprofit space, and I don't blame us, historically, we haven't been taught the realm, the full, spectrum of options available to us in terms of civic engagement. Because maybe we crossed over from, military dispensations into a democracy that, at best, is a cosmetic democracy, because there's not even civic education happening in schools. So citizens don't know how to engage. Even NGOs, we don't know how to engage. The only form of engagement we recognize is protest. And that's not intelligent. It's like a child who just, I want this, I want this, I want this. You don't get it. Next thing you throw a tantrum. There are very many effective ways we need to learn how to engage. Sometimes you're engaging by making movies, by partnering with Nollywood to roll out a stream of movies. Sometimes you're engaging by partnering with, Instagram comedians to roll out skits. Sometimes, you're engaging by requesting for meetings or printing out your press statements in the newspapers. Sometimes you're engaging by, holding a press conference and inviting the media to show it and publish it on TV. But if that's too expensive, then you decide, okay, you know what? We'll have it in our community in a town hall format, and the communique will be submitted to the relevant decision makers. Or if they refuse to read our communique, we'll publish it, on strategic notice boards across the National Assembly. There are many effective ways one can engage if one is critical and sits down to actually think, what will get to this person? What will reach them? How can I do it in a way that they hear it, they read it, they see it, and they're compelled to act? So you have to think about this. Next slide, please. Having talked about stakeholders and doing your due diligence to identify them, study them, profile them clearly, what makes them act, how will they, how will you present the evidence? What's a very compelling way to sway them to action? Let's deal with your issue. The issue you're working on, how would you frame it? It's very essential that you even recognize where to situate your issue. Because something society is hearing for the first time. Something society is entertaining it for the first time. For instance, as at, I dare say, maybe 10 years ago, We weren't hearing all this climate change, climate impact mitigation strategies, climate mitigation, climate adaptation. These were not things we were familiar with. So those people who came into the scene and were saying, look, this is a global conversation. It's happening in other parts of the world, but it's not happening enough in Nigeria or across Africa. And they're telling us the evidence has been gathered and it is clear enough that the environment is reacting and the earth is threatening to expire before us. And if we don't begin to mitigate effectively our climate practices, we are all going to suffer the worsening effects of climate change. Whether it's cities that will be submerged with floods, coastal cities submerged, or extreme worsening conditions of heat. Already this year alone, the heat has been near melting. Any observant person recognizes that every year it's getting hotter. Even your ACs are struggling to be effective. Your car AC, you need to put it on virtually, the highest pulse for it to even keep you cool. So we are in a dire situation. Those people who started this conversation, those maybe like I said, about 10 years ago, maybe I might be wrong, maybe it was earlier, but this is, I think, when I even became familiar with these conversations, right? They were setting the agenda. You would easily say that we could place them in agendas because they were new conversations. They were bringing these conversations to the public knowledge for the first time. These conversations were coming into public discourse settings for the first time. Unlike when you hear topics like gender equality, I think we've heard it constantly. So those who set the agenda, they've done their work. It's now a topical thing. In fact, now we're having a session where there's a tension, so immediately you go into some setting and you need to just say gender, people react. I want feminists today, things like that. That's because already that thing has meaning. It connotes something in the mind of people. They've heard it so much, they're seeing it as this women empowerment thing. You want to disrupt the known order of patriarchy. You want to disrupt, the traditional systems we've all embraced previously. That's because people are familiar with what you are saying. They've heard it, right? So if you're in gender, well, maybe you're not necessarily in a gender setting. Maybe now you want to shape the debate. You want to say, look, the way gender has been introduced to you, it's almost as though there's a war. It's not a war. Gender, is a friendly conversation, and it affects both boys and girls because in many places, some boys are the ones at risk. For instance, in many places where we do our work in education, we recognize that at secondary school level, for instance, in many parts of the East in Nigeria, the boy is more at risk of dropping out than the girl child. So there are disparities. So sometimes gender responsive work will protect the boy child and not even just the girl child. But there's this, implicit or this reaction or instinctive feeling amongst the public the minute you hear gender that we're fighting just for women's rights. Yes, traditionally, women have been the disadvantaged population. So it's only natural that to a large extent, most of the gender, measures will be trying to introduce equity in the dealings with women. But I just need to stress that gender does also protect the rights of boys. And if it's done properly, as it should be and systematically, it helps us recognize threats to boys as well and curb it before these threats materialize. So sometimes if you're in the gender work, maybe you might not be in a gender setting. Maybe you might be in, framing the conversation in a way that the public can revisit it. Maybe it might be to provide alternatives to an existing policy. Look at, for instance, the 5, constitution amendment, bills that were flung out. These were issues of debate shaping. For instance, one is saying, look, citizenship in Nigeria, if, when a male citizen marries a female, a foreign spouse who's female, automatically she's conferred with citizenship, but it doesn't work that way for women. And so, citizenship, let's revisit citizenship. Why should we have a situation where a Nigerian woman marries a foreigner and cannot confer on him automatically citizenship? And so he relocates back to Nigeria with her. He has to even struggle to open a bank account, things like that, So you're revisiting a conversation, right? So maybe you need to frame. So it's important where you place your issue because it's going to identify who you should be talking to, who matters, who you should be having a conversation with, right? That's why I said gender, for instance, is not a new issue. So, for instance, I don't need to go and start educating NGOs on these topics. But those who brought the conversation earlier, those who started this work way before us, way ahead, they were the ones engaging the non-profit, the NGOs, the CSOs, civil society organizations, the traditional leaders. They were going into the grassroots communities, right? So you need to frame your issue. what is your issue first and foremost? But we're not going into that today. We're dealing with advocacy. So I'm assuming you know your issue. I'm not going to deal with how you identify your issue, how to solve a problem that actually exists, because some people are in the business of solving problems that only exist in their head or affect only their family members. And that's why I say do your research before you go and pick up an issue and build an entire NGO around that issue. You must have done your proper research to identify that this is a population-wide problem and not just something affecting your family members. Anyways, that's a joke. But nevertheless, like I said, frame your issue. Where is it? Is it a matter of policy, right? So I currently work as an international Nigerian consultant for the International Agency for Education in Emergencies. Interagency network, sorry, for education in emergencies. And I realized that prior to COVID, education in emergencies was not something people knew. And in fact, you know, even though we have an EIE, Education in Emergencies Working Group in Nigeria, a lot of the focal attention has been on the Northeast. And so most of the resources, the mandates, the actions have been focused on the Northeast. And few of the other states across the country are prepared. We don't have emergency preparedness when it comes to education. We don't have, you know, enough structures in place for effective responses, and not to talk about recovery. So even though we've experienced COVID, we're all going back to square one again, where if the next, whatever the next crisis is that comes is, we will still be, you know, reacting rather than being proactive, right? And I think it's, for me, it's counterintuitive, because just as human beings, we know that crisis is a constant, right? One of the very many constant facts we know about life is there will always be setbacks. So you have to always have plans in place for setbacks. Even when we do our own plans as individuals and companies, we put in place contingencies. So every practical society, every intelligent society should have emergency preparedness, you know, structures in place. So maybe that's where I function when it comes to EIE. In the aspect of policy, how do we have ministerial guidelines for EIE that guide departments and units and directorates in the ministries of education towards, you know, effective actions every day, not just when the crisis sets in? How do we make sure, for instance, that we digitize our entire curriculum and have it in an archive so that, God forbid, but the next time schooling is disrupted, we don't have a situation where children cannot access learning materials, because everything is digitized and maybe it's free to download. Things like these are conversations that, you know, policy should approach. So you have to identify where is your issue. And when you do identify where is your issue, it's critical because it leads you to who you should be talking to. Who are the stakeholders that are critical, that matter? For instance, I know that in a lot of my lobbying for EIE policies, I should be talking to government people. I should be talking to researchers. I should be talking to the media. I should leverage the media a lot, right? I should push out, you know, interviews. I should push out researched reports, right? So these are the things that will guide you when you are designing your strategies to disseminate your advocacy campaign. Next slide, please. Again, as we talk about, you know, identifying your issue, I know I said I wasn't going to delve into that, but let's discuss it a little bit, you know, and this involves brainstorming, and brainstorming should not involve your own brain alone. You know, have your team with you. Sometimes it's a young organization that you're running. Maybe you don't have a large team. You're working with volunteers who maybe they're in school, they don't quite have experience, right? But you have one or two friends who understand the issues. They have a passion for it. Maybe you even invited them to join your board. Have a meeting, have sessions with your you know, have your thought process should be aided by some support group. You need to have some support group that helps you in your thinking, your process. Brainstorm with these groups of people. Ask them questions. You will think together. You know, this issue that we're working on, who are the people that are affected by this issue as we know today? And based on what evidence? Do you understand? So sometimes it's good to even challenge yourself further to say, based on what evidence? So if I say, for instance, this matter of, you know, out of school children, who is affected? Naturally, okay, children. And based on what evidence? Oh, the last UNESCO report published that it has grown to 13 million out of school in Nigeria, even though the Federal Ministry of Education queried that and said, no, that report is wrong. You know, so things like that, you begin to push out evidence that you've been reading because it challenges you to go and read. Who else is affected by the issue? You know, citizens in any society or residents of any, you know, state, community that are dealing with this growing number of children who ought to be learning but are not learning. They are affected by the issue because these children, they should be in the classroom, are out on the streets. They're begging, they're hawking, they're this. It's a menace. It's an affront to all, civilized society beings that we entertain this kind of reality. So it affects us. Who else is affected by the issue? The government officials whose mandates specifically cover education, because education, as we know, is a public, is in chapter 2. It's part of the fundamental obligations and social directives of governance. So my state governor is affected by this issue because it's evidence of the failure of the state. The minute these numbers keep growing, it's evidence of the failure of the state. The commissioners that he puts in these offices, they are directly affected because it's evidence of their failure, right? The funding multilateral institutions of the world who say that they want to eliminate or, end all situations of out-of-school children, it's evident the very existence of this growing number or population of out-of-school children is clear evidence of discordance between their own role and this reality. So you point out everybody that is affected by the issue. Who will have influence over the issue? You say, okay, those people that come and talk to these government officials or citizens who vote, community resident, members, parents, school authorities, well-meaning individuals, private sector partners. These are people that, they have influence. They have the power to influence decision makers because maybe they fund elections, maybe they support campaigns, maybe their platform can embarrass a local governor, things like that. You identify them. Media moguls, some people whose media platform, just one statement from their media platform, if BBC does a sex for grades documentary and releases it, next thing, university starts shaking because they've been held accountable for this menace that has been occurring in their institutions for so long, right? So you discover that even media platforms have power. Then you begin to identify, okay, so this helps you to identify your stakeholders. This is how you can go about it. Oh, these NGOs are also affected by the issue, or they affect the issue because their mission statement is in this area. Save the Children wants to work to ensure that every child, can achieve total well-being, psychosocial, blah, 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 blah. Therefore, they will be affected by the growing number of out-of-school children. You'll be mapping. Oh, Care Nigeria. Oh, this NGO, this international NGO. Oh, in my community, this local philanthropist, map. So these are questions you can ask to help you get to these effective, names, these key stakeholders that you need to work with or to target in your advocacy campaigns. And as you're doing so, also recognize those who will stand against you, those who will oppose you, those who benefit from the status quo. Because I always tell people, don't ignore those who benefit from the status quo. For everything that is wrong around you, somebody is benefiting. And the minute you can use that rational economic theory to identify them, you're better, because if not, you will not anticipate the attacks, the measures that they will come, they will use to come after your own advocacy campaign because they're benefiting and you're literally taking food away from them when you're beginning to try to disrupt the status quo. Next. When you've identified these people, this quadrant will help you, not might help you. Because again, remember, we've done a very vast exercise. You ask certain questions. Who has influence over this problem? Who is affected by this problem? Sometimes the person that is affected by the problem has no power to change the situation. So you need to be able to now categorize all these stakeholders you've mentioned. The children who are out of school, who are affected by the situation, they have no power to change their situation. They're helpless, right? So you use this power interest quadrant to begin to map and position your key stakeholders. Because depending on who is in the high power and high interest position, that will determine who you should be targeting, when you should be targeting them, and how you should be engaging them, how strategic you need to be, right? So for some people, they have a high amount of power, but they have very low interest in the issue. They're not interested. It doesn't affect them either ways. Yeah. They know it's bad, but they're never going to do anything about it, even though they have the power to influence it. You need those kinds of people because you must sway them. You must move them to the place where they're interested enough to act. Or you must manage them so they never, even right now, maybe they're just, uninterested, neutral, right? They must never shift from neutrality to working against you. That is to a point where they are highly interested in your outcome not being met. It's better that you even keep them neutral. So these are things you must be conscious of. Some people have low interest. That is, they're not really affected by it, but they do have They also have maybe low power over the situation. You don't need to waste maybe such time on those kinds of people. Some people have high power and they have high interest. So it's almost as if where they are, they've been trying to, you just need to find a way to connect with those kinds of people. I gave an example earlier when I was saying maybe there's a lawmaker who wants to leave a legacy. And that legacy, he wants to just put one legacy defining bill. He doesn't even care the bill. Maybe it's left to you to tell him that, did you know that in the history of the 60 something years of Nigeria, there has never once been a bill brought up on the floor of this house on so and so. The person's eyes will just light up that, yeah, so this could be my legacy. You must connect with that kind. You have to find those kinds of people. And that involves doing your research and your homework. Next. Yeah. So again, when you map these people, this is an example. This is a clear rubric to follow, a rule of thumb that you can practice. Those who have a high amount of, power over your issue, but low interest, like I said, your best bet, if at all you don't want to sway them to, high interest, just keep them satisfied. The way they are neutral is better for you than if they now begin to be your antagonists. So you just need to keep them satisfied. Make sure that nothing disrupts their current level of comfort. They're where they are. They will never vote against you, even if they don't actively work for you, but they will never vote against you, right? You want those kinds of situations to exist. Those who have a high amount of interest and a high amount of power are the ones you're managing closely because they're your allies. They're the ones who will get you to Uhuru, to where you want to get to in terms of the effect or the outcomes of your advocacy that you're seeking. They are the ones who will be instrumental in their own duty. Everybody occupies a duty post. So some of them might be policymakers, some of them might be donors, some of them, they are highly interested in funding that intervention. They've just been trying to connect with somebody at the ground level or grassroots level who is pursuing this same kind of mission. Remember, I gave the example of a woman investor who's just been looking that she wants to just support people, young women in rice farming. Maybe for some, I don't know, childhood reason. Maybe her late grandmother was a rice farmer. So there's some sentiment for her. It might be a matter of sentiment, but that is her own area. The minute you connect with that kind of person who wants to empower young women in agro, and those are the people you will manage because you'll be working with them. You don't break the relationship. You keep showing them reports. You keep showing them evidence. You keep giving them proof that their work is meaningful. They're giving you donations. They're supporting their constant investment in your own mission and your work on the field is, improving the world, things like that. So you manage those relationships closely. For those who have a high amount of, a low amount of power, but high interest, you have to keep monitoring them. They have high interest. They just don't have enough power, right? But you must monitor them. Sometimes they're activists like you. They're NGOs like you. So share reports with them. Bring them together. Ask them for what their activities are. What have they been doing? Form a coalition. Have strategic meetings with them. Find out who their own allies are. Form mergers. These are kinds of things you can do. Reach out to them, ask them for their, collaborations, collaborate a lot with them so that your audience and their audience can merge and the numbers gain, things like that. Also, those who might have, high interest in your situation but low power, keep them well informed. Keep them well informed because you don't want a situation where they begin to see you as exploitative. Where they feel, and that's what happens with a lot of NGOs. NGOs go into communities and then they do work for communities, and the communities begin to feel that the NGO benefited more than the community. The NGOs, were using them as a platform to make money. So we have that a lot in a lot of communities because NGOs felt that even though they were affected by the issues and they had a high interest in the matter, but they didn't have power. So NGOs were not accountable to these people. But you don't want a situation where communities you want to work for don't trust you. Trust me, it's a terrible situation where your community, the person you're targeting does not trust you. So that's something that the previous, I would say, the last generation of nonprofits, I think they scored low in this because quite a number of communities have a terrible impression of NGOs. And that's because maybe NGOs did not carry them along. They weren't keeping them informed. They weren't sharing reports with them. They weren't transparent enough with them. You don't want to fall into that kind of situation. Even though any community or group of people you consider your stakeholders have low power to change the situation or to affect the status quo, but they have a high interest in that situation, please carry them along at all times. Keep them constantly, continuously informed on all aspects of what you're doing. Have their representatives attend your meetings. Have their representatives accompany you when you're going for high-level meetings and encounters with people in government. carry them along. It is very key. Next slide, please. And then having said that, when you've done all that, how to engage? You need to engage. You need to move, right? We said after having done your research, having done your, collected your evidence, you've done your strategic mapping, you must move to action. You have to engage. You have to, but your outreach strategy must again be built out of, careful thinking. You have to understand, you have to gain an understanding of how these people feel about your project. Sample, go and do samples. So even when we do interventions, we try to do initial assessments. So you go into spaces, you have meetings with a cross section of stakeholders. You go to the government stakeholders, you go to NGO stakeholders, you go to community representatives, you go to disability rights networks, you go to different networks and groups, you go to school teachers. You just want to have an understanding of how do you perceive projects like this? Have you had encounters with projects like this before? It's critical because it will guide you in your own next steps, your process. What do you need to correct? What mistakes must you not repeat? These people have been burnt a certain way before. There's a trauma from the activities of the previous people, and you want to make sure that your actions do not reinforce those traumas. Your actions do not, strike them as a repeat of the past. So it's always good to do initial assessments, to just sample these people, have chats with them, call them in for focus groups, have one-on-one interviews. Oh, you're thinking of doing this. What are their thoughts? So these are important things. Ask them specifically how they feel about your organization. Have they heard about you before? Have they heard about this project before? What are their thoughts? Oh, you once did a project or a campaign for, so maybe, I don't know, think of any random campaign you did as an NGO. Go to the community, ask them, did they ever hear about that campaign? What did they think about it? Did they welcome it? Was it useful to them? Did they approve of it? What do they want? Would they like to see it happen again? Things like that. Find out from them what their motivations are. What do they want out of life? What is motivating their actions every day? What do they want to happen? What are the desires in their minds for communities? For instance, communities will tell you we no longer want to keep recording the abduction of our school girls. We want security for our children. Some communities will tell you we don't want our pregnant women to die anymore. Our rate of maternal mortality is too bad. All we want is a primary healthcare center that is well equipped with beds, with qualified personnel, with good, respectful matrons that will take care of the needs of our pregnant women. So find out what motivates them. They say, oh, in the last 10 years, do you know that we've recorded so number of deaths? That is a motivation. That will help you know that if you bring a project in a certain kind of project, the community will embrace it. If you bring another kind of project, the community might just treat it as it's just another thing. So it's not about what you think is best for them. It's about what they want for themselves, what they see, what they welcome for themselves, what they consider to be progress, what they define as progress. Seek, to hear from these groups of communities. Find out the level of information that they have. Sometimes people act out of ignorance. Sometimes people's actions, in fact, a lot of the times, our actions are influenced by the depth of knowledge we have or the lack of depth of knowledge we possess. And extrapolate this from individual level to even group level to community level, it's the same thing. Some communities are living in the conditions they're living in because of the status, the level of cognitive, reasoning of that community. And by that, I mean the level of information that has reached a wide spectrum of its members that they're able to apply into their lives, things like that. So sometimes you might need to correct wrong information. Some communities are operating on the basis of wrong-held beliefs, false beliefs, myths. You might need to explode those myths. And that's why people use campaigns. Campaigns correct a lot of false myths that people harbor, and they build their entire life practices around false beliefs. So you might want to even discover what's the level of information circulating in this community. Is it traditional held beliefs that are not even true? That evidence has proven that these things are not true? Things like that. You might want to correct it. Who are the strong influencers? Is it religious leaders that are constantly pushing out messages that are influencing them? You might need to check. Is it, thought leaders? There are some people they go to. For instance, when we work in some rural communities, why some women will not go to primary healthcare centers? Because traditional birth attendants, they are not just, people who help them deliver babies. There are women who give them counsel even in their marriages. They counsel them. They help them deal with their marital troubles. They even have a cooperative. They help them do savings. So those kinds of people have strong influence over the lives of these women, that even though the delivery practices of these women will endanger their lives, they will keep going back there. So you have to make sure that orthodox primary healthcare centers can, provide an equivalent of those kinds of services for these women, because these traditional birth attendants are not just service providers, they are a community for these women. So you have to understand this community. You have to understand people, why they act the way they do, the cultures driving them, the values, the belief systems. And then in turn, you must find out who do they influence, because they are sometimes the beliefs that they're harboring, they're perpetuating it and sending it into the next generation. So you have to engage. Next slide. When you've done all of these things and you've engaged, it helps you when you're doing your categorization. So you know that, stakeholder 6 should be on the high power, high interest quadrant. Stakeholder 2 should be on, high interest, but low power. You begin to apportion, and then you know that, okay, for this one, and it means that you're literally going to have names. You're not going to put stakeholder 2, you put the name. Maybe you will say, this company, I must manage them closely, because they always invest in issues of maybe children who have autism. Maybe that company's mission statement is to dedicate its CSR towards supporting the development, the progress, the full education of children living with autism. And maybe your own nonprofit is working in the area of helping support autistic children. So you now manage those kinds of sponsors closely, those kinds of organizations or entities closely. Sometimes it might be a government official who, when you first started working with the person, maybe it was a local government council. Next thing, the person has moved, has been elevated, and is now, in a Lagos agency. But from there, he has been recommended to the federal government as special advisor. You keep working with that person, even if the person's area of work is now shifting from where you keep engaging them. You keep informing them. Just manage that relationship. These are examples of how to keep your stakeholders carefully engaged. And I also talked with you about even those who are, high interest but low power. Don't make the mistake of thinking that people with low power should be neglected, omitted, and you don't carry them along. That's a very terrible error to commit. So always, the least you can do is share your reports with them. Have them in the periphery, in your aerial view, where they're always hearing, they're always getting constant reports. They will go and update their communities, and it will ensure that your access into that community is never terminated. You always have right of ingress and egress into their community, because they trust you. In the space that you're working in development, trust is a great currency. Do whatever you can never to erode trust, because trust is capital, is capital in the bank. I tell you, it's as good as capital in the bank. Next slide. So I've come to the end of my presentation. Let me just highlight again my final thoughts. You have to be strategic. You have to be very strategic, not only in mapping out your stakeholders, but even in how you engage with them. When you're writing a letter, I gave an example. When you're writing a letter to companies for the first time, don't just use generic. Go and do your research and find out what they too want to achieve, and tell them why working with you moves them closer to achieving their own dreams as a company. Revisit your stakeholder map often. Don't just do it in 2020 and then you leave it into 2022 and you're still, I'm still working with that company. Meanwhile, 5 new, stakeholders have sprung up on the scene. Timing is everything. You have to be very sensitive to time. Sometimes that time is your moment, and you must launch. Sometimes back off. It's not the right time, right? But you must still be building momentum. Build off existing networks. So, like I said, join forces a lot, belong in communities of practice, collaborate with nonprofits, just exist within a community. You can't afford to work in isolation when you're in this space. And finally, I repeat, be strategic with stakeholders. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to engage further on any questions.
Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. Wow, that was a very insightful session. I really just love how you dissected the topic and you zoomed into global advocacy with so many pragmatic examples. it really drove home your points. So really appreciate the time. One of the key highlights for me was you mentioning those three big things across that I think when you were trying to emphasize the connection between evidence and impact, and you captured it in three key points, which is to identify, to prioritize, and I love the emphasis here there around creating a power interest map, and then you move further to say engage. And how do you engage? You cut across almost like eight different very cogent questions that you should be asking your stakeholders, while engaging them. And it's really about creating that outreach engagement with them, engagement strategy. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. Very insightful. Thank you so much. So let's move on quickly. Exactly. Very excellent presentation. We could just have you continue, but we also have another segment of this session, which is the question and answer forum, which is in two phases. First, I would reel out our own set of questions. We already have curated questions from some of our attendees, and then we'll also take in more questions from live attendees at the moment. So, attendees, thank you so much for joining us. Type in the comment section any question you have in mind, and definitely we will take it up as we continue continue with the second phase of this webinar. All right, so let me quickly drive in to the one of the questions that comes to mind. So I know that as a leader who has developed several successful advocacy strategies and programs that have achieved international recognition, are there likely challenges, risks, and mistakes you made before you got it right? And would really love you to zoom into some of these challenges and how you mitigated against these challenges, and you even converted these challenges to solutions that pave way for more impact and more strategic advocacy.
Thanks, Tony. I think a very good question. And I don't, let me just, establish, look, you're bound to keep making mistakes. The most important thing is to be very sensitive and to, to be very, have your lens, constantly monitoring so that you can even, detect early the mistakes you're making. No matter how well and effectively planned a strategy is, sometimes maybe even your risk analysis, there may be flaws. For instance, we recently worked on a project and it was built around a set of assumptions, but and it was even we built these assumptions in the aftermath of COVID. So it's not as though we didn't know that COVID had already come, and so we already saw how COVID was shifting the landscape. But we didn't fully appreciate the economic, implications of COVID, which are still unfolding, and the crisis that would hit many economies, and how that would affect government budgets, how that would affect local, even individual spending. So a lot of assumptions came into the design of that project, and those assumptions are today clearly inaccurate. And so, I'm seeing that the outcomes we set out to achieve, even though we've pumped resources into it, we're not able to achieve them within the time frame. But I think within the first 3 months of execution, we already saw that our assumptions, we saw it. So maybe, we had already started, but at least it helped us not to keep hemorrhaging funds. So sometimes I say that to tell you that if you're monitoring, if you're really effectively tracking things, you may catch your mistakes early and avoid, the full ambit of, effect of that mistake. That's one. In the early days when I started, a lot of things I'm telling you now I did not practice. For instance, I tended more to work alone. I didn't exist in communities of practice. You don't do this game. You don't do advocacy alone. There's a movie. If you watch if you read the book, Madiba. If you watch the movie of Nelson Mandela, and remember, there's a scene where those young boys came, and they saw this Madiba that they've been hearing about in prison. He's a legend in prison. And they came and saw the man, and I think, we were planting vegetables. And you know how young people, your blood is hot, your blood is hot. They thought that Madiba would be causing fights in prison every day. Because, and so they were very angry that, look at you, old man, we're fighting and dying for you. And here you are, talking to the guards, plucking tomatoes with them and things like that. And I remember that, he basically, he did a symbol that when you stand like this, they can terminate you. But when you do like this, when you're like this, they can't get you, and basically, and I'm paraphrasing a lot, but essentially what he was signaling was, look, you walk alone, there's a limit to what you can do. But you work together, not only can your enemies not penetrate, but even the joint forces that all of you can achieve together, it basically leads you to a lot of quantum leaps, right? So I recommend that for those of us who are in this business. The NGO working in the same mission field as you is not your competitor. Trust me, the 17 global sustainable development goals, there is enough money coming from the international community to support those goals. So don't be worried that, oh, if I collaborate, the donor will see them, they won't see me. You're wasting your time. This problem is so huge that you alone cannot solve it. It's bigger than you. And they're having General Assembly meetings at the UN monthly to tackle these problems. When you collaborate, you're more, attractive to even those multilateral, institutions as a vehicle to fund towards achieving certain outcomes. So work with, collaborate a lot. I say that as evidence of my past mistakes. I've had better outcomes when I joined coalitions and we work together as a coalition, or when I joined, forces with other, maybe 2 or 3 other nonprofits, and we wrote a grant application together to do. Not only will they release, if you're individual, they'll only be giving you small grants, maybe $40,000 and things like that, because your structure may not be large enough to accommodate a $200,000 grant. But when you're working with 4 other institutions or organizations together, and you're able to say, oh, this 4, with this 4, we'll reach the Southwest, we'll reach the Northeast, we'll reach the this, we'll reach the that. Then people say, I'll commit this higher number of resources to your hands. I will give you technical assistance. Sometimes not even just money. They will also support you with technical assistance. They teach you your reporting. All those things that consultants do that blow your head. Next thing you find that you have the capacity to do it as well. So I would say that in this work, collaborate. And then, as cliche as it sounds, never repeat the same mistake twice. If you found you did something and it didn't work, don't do it again. Please avoid making the same mistakes twice.
Powerful. I just love how you again just were very vulnerable with the challenges, and you have accentuated the importance of monitoring and evaluation. That was your very first point, and you moved on to say again, we have heard it, but from your own experience, you're again rehashing it to say collaboration, you can't overflog it. It's just so powerful. And then moving on, I love how you just rounded it off with that point saying don't repeat the same mistake twice. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. So this takes me to this question, which speaks to how can nonprofits and entrepreneurs leverage on advocacy trends and opportunities for their organizations, and how can they position their organizations for this new phase. So you have shared with us a challenge that came up based on making wrong assumptions about a trend, or COVID happened and all of that. So you have shared some of the lessons, and I just want you to again zoom in on how nonprofits and social entrepreneurs can leverage advocacy trends and opportunities for their organizations.
Yeah, it's a very great point. One of the things we need to recognize is when events happen in the public domain and grip the attention of the public, that's it. I talked about in the final thoughts, I talked about timing. Timing is critical. Understand the seasons that are occurring. I remember is it last year or early? Yeah, late last year, the situation with Sylvester, the young boy who was bullied in school and led to his
Yes.
death, right?
Yes.
That was a moment. And I saw that a couple of maybe NGOs who had been working in that space of, dealing with young people, peer pressure, psychosocial development of the youth, helping young people avoid drug substance abuse. That was the moment, because bullying is a symptom of several other, issues affecting young people. Sometimes it's dysfunction from the home, not enough parental supervision. Sometimes it's abuse. Sometimes it's, exposure to drugs and substances. Sometimes it's just joining the wrong peer groups and gangs and, getting into violent territories, right? But essentially, if we have better systems for mentoring young people, for supporting them psychosocially, will record better success stories out of our young people as they're evolving into adults, right? So that's a moment for teenage NGOs, for NGOs working with teenagers, NGOs working to, push for campaigns against drugs. Campaigns. So it's not until your mission statement talks about bullying. That was a moment. I remember, for instance, when MTN years ago, I was pretty young that time, released that advert, Mama Na Boy.
Yes.
And the public erupted in furor. And it was one of those moments that led to the push, for gender equality, because the pro-equality, gender, based NGOs seized the moment. And then they began to, interact with the Nigerian space and telling the public, these things stem out of cultural held values and beliefs. We discriminate. And so a company can come and have this advert and it will pass through all the approval because they don't see it as, they don't understand that they're perpetuating something. And that thing, it might seem innocuous or harmless to them, but those things reinforce this notion that one gender is superior to the other, is worthy of far more celebration than the other. Think that. So they seize the moment and use that to introduce the Nigerian public to gender conversations. That's how you can seize moments. Sometimes it may not be, and then it may be something very unrelated, but it's your moment. Seize it. Seize it. So that's how you can jump on certain trends. Call a press conference. Show people evidence of so many incidents being recorded in our communities of gender-based violence as a result of, corporate ads or this or that, or company activities that have led to so and so products into the market and reaching teenagers who cannot exercise, judgment when making purchasing decisions. That's your moment. And then you begin to call the attention of the government that these actions must be prescribed. A policy must be passed, things like that. Bring the media into the furor, because the media too, they're looking for, everybody will ride that wave. So that's what I always advise nonprofits or NGOs. If something is happening, you may not have started it, but that wave, ride it and make noise as if you started it, because the outcome you're seeking will be better realized if you ride that wave.
Powerful. I just love how you emphasized that phrase, seize the moment. So when it comes to any nonprofit, social innovator, or change maker, leveraging trends, advocacy trends, and opportunities, the key word is to seize the moment and ride upon that wave. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. So I will be asking my next question, which is in the line of how we saw the pressure in 2020 when COVID-19 hit the world and there was a massive setback in the educational sector. As a consultant for the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies in Nigeria, what innovative advocacy programs and activities would you advise nonprofits and entrepreneurs who are advocates in the education sector? What should they build for the future, and how should they build for the future?
Thank you. So just as somebody working very closely in the space, if you're an entrepreneur, one thing I'll advise is, and you're interested in education, then edtech is your area. Because look, technology, we have to, when we may not have realized it yet, or our policymakers have not realized it yet, but it's an inevitable future, and it's a future where we are all going to leverage technology to deliver teaching beyond the classroom. Those who get into the edtech space and give us content that is local. So there's a lot of things. There's Khan Academy, there's Coursera, there's a lot of content out there, but the pedagogy is not ours. There's a way our children learn. There's a way we learn, which is built around our cultures, the sounds we hear, the way the teacher is going to instruct us, right? People who want to get into the space of education should leverage technology to deliver or disseminate content for school children. Donors should support young entrepreneurs, innovative minds, creative software people, whatever, to build those, that future. The future is the child learning with through technology. And we must also focus on the teachers. The teachers have to be trained in the pedagogy of the new classroom. The new classroom has an interface and it's a screen, it's a computer screen. But our teachers, we have to create a new generation or cohort of teachers who understand how to leverage technology for effective classroom delivery. Sometimes they might be sitting face-to-face with the child, right? And sometimes they might not. But nevertheless, they have to understand that that child has access to the internet. So even if I'm sitting in front of you, that child may have had a subject or those subjects or have watched all kinds of content online. And so when I'm coming before the child, there's a prior teacher. And my intelligence is being measured against, I'm being rated against the standard of that internet. That teacher, the internet is their teacher, right? And so my credibility is tied to the standards that have been set before them on the internet. If I fail in the classroom as a teacher to live up to that standard, I lose credibility. They no longer listen to me. So we have to train the next cohort of teachers not only to understand how to teach via WhatsApp, Zoom, Google. They just need to know it. They can't run away from it. It is the future. But they must
Yes.
also understand how to effectively teach, deliver quality, right? Nonprofits must be in the business of pushing for policies. We have to digitize the curriculum. Every child should be able to access learning content, whether it's their sub-school subjects, the Ministry of Education should be able to walk into a portal and the approved curriculum for this year or whatever 5-year period we're using, an archive where I can go in and maybe they put a small fee. But if it's Ministry of Education, it's a public service, right? The child must be able to access a portal via the Ministry of Information where he or she can access their school subjects. So that's the future we're getting to. And nonprofits should be positioned for that. We have to push for digitization of the curriculum. We have to push for emergency preparedness. We're not prepared. Our teachers, private sector can adapt, our public sector cannot. There's complete lack of learning. And if you think that every child will be reached through radio and television with all these our telecast and school on airs and all those things, we're wasting our time. But we also need to prepare with the right infrastructures. Governments have to put in the right infrastructure. This idea of the third world is because we don't have roads, we don't have light, we don't have internet, we don't have telecoms. And that's why, because as long as you cannot conquer space and time, you are a third world creature. So this is why we must put those infrastructures. We have to have those infrastructures so that our children can access learning. The way I'm talking to people now, my 6-year-old, when school closed, was able to reach her teacher. A public sector child, this public school child should have the same right, not a privilege. This, segregation of learning that we've condoned is not helping us. Education is the foundation of social order. And if we entertain this parallel system where children of the privileged can get an education and children of the market woman and the bus driver cannot, where it's counterintuitive, it's an act of sabotage, because we'll get as adults, we'll all come into the same public spaces. And if we did not train the minds of the other people's children, then all we will witness is chaos. So we've got to get back to the drawing room. But to the question, I do believe that the focus should be on EdTech. I do believe that the focus should be on teacher capacity building, teacher development, aggressively teacher development, and also teacher welfare, and many other things, and digitizing curriculums. Like I said, EdTech.
Powerful. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. I just love again how you're just emphasizing that the future is technology. And I love how you're saying we need to close the gap. We need to breach that dichotomy between those in the private sector and the public sector. You can't say, okay, we've gotten it right in the private schools or private education system, and there is that huge gap that needs to be closed within the public system. If we don't do that, we are set on a very chaotic path. Thank you so much, Barrister Eda. Now, this takes me to the importance of research, design research, and methodology. And I know with what you do, you deploy this a lot, and you emphasize this during your presentation. I would want you to share with us specific design research and methodologies that support targeted advocacy projects for nonprofits and social entrepreneurs. Just share with us a few.
Well, I mean, it's difficult I don't want to oversimplify, some of these methodologies. My professors in the university institutions will lock me up. But at the end of the day, look, we have to also democratize knowledge, right?
Yes.
What I always tell people, look, you don't need to go and dedicate your life to getting your PhD before you begin to employ research methods in your work. And you're already doing it. Many people are doing it. You just don't know. And you just need to maybe standardize it or formalize it better. First and foremost, the easiest form of research is your desk research. By desk research, the way I'm sitting down on a desk and I have my internet and my computer accessible, I just put in keywords on Google. I have access to certain library passwords. Maybe you have a library, code for a certain university, or you have friends who might have these access codes. Get some libraries and get materials and just begin to read, study, you know. So desk research can be your first bet. Read newspaper articles published before, asking questions, telling you the information. Read reports, World Bank reports, UNESCO reports, GEM reports, Global Education Monitoring reports. Read reports. They're easy. They're your hack because they've done the work. These multilateral institutions, they have the capacity, they have the funding, they can deploy local researchers and gather this information for you, right? Read reports. Every year, every quarter, these reports are being churned out. Read reports. Now, at the level of your local intervention, go to your community. I said all those things when we say ask them questions, ask them their motivation. I'm describing it something like maybe a focus group. If you work in women empowerment, you work for pregnant women, you want to improve pregnant care, you want to do this, you want to do that, call them, go to where they go to, invite them, that you just want to have a stakeholder meeting. And that for you, that stakeholder meeting is you want to, for you, the focus group your purpose is to identify maybe what their concerns are, you want to be able to use that as a baseline to know what their challenges are, their problems are, before you can now begin to design or conceptualize your program and intervention based on the desk research you've done, right? Sometimes you might also map out some people you want to interview. Maybe a matron, a traditional, maybe a foremost woman who does female genital mutilation. You want to interview her. Oh, Mama, how long have you been doing this? Why do families bring their daughters to you? You're going in with a very objective, you're not going in judgmental, you're just asking questions. You seek interviews with the maybe traditional leaders, the religious leaders. Oh, in this community, we noticed that a lot of girls, go through FGM rights. Tell us the history of this in your community. How long have you been doing it? Is there a reason why you do it? What have been the observations from this? Do you feel that it really results in this? Ask them questions. So that's focus group. Sometimes it's interview format, one-on-one. All these methods is what we do when when you're trying to get your master's degree. If you really went to school and you didn't get somebody to do it for you, all those things you did, you're supposed to apply it even in the real world. It doesn't end when you leave school, right? These are the methods. You want to know, and you don't want this knowledge you gather to be built around your own opinions. You must move away from opinion or conjecture or guessing to real, fact-based evidence. If I consult 50 people before I do it, is it not better than sitting in my house and speculating? So if I say I want to work in the community to address a problem of, why are people always burning fire? Even though climate change, we are climate mitigation and adaptation, why do people burn bush? And I go around 50 households and I say, can I please speak with the adult members of this household? Please, we just have a structured set of questions we would like you to answer. Sometimes you might give them survey instruments for those that are literate. But if you're going into deep community, you don't bother with anything writing. You just ask them, I just want to ask you questions. And you just ask them and say, we will burn it. Nobody comes to collect it. The government does not come to collect it. Our children will die of disease. You're gathering information. You say, okay, a pattern has been observed whereby 90% of the households resort to independent waste, management practices. Interactions with them prove that the reason why they are embarking on this is failure of maybe government services to come in on time, fear of diseases and blah 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 blah, things like that. Then it's based on that you now begin to do your intervention. Oh, if chief of the reasons cited is that government does not come and clear on time, maybe if we redesign the waste management, waste collection system, it will lead to less fire burning. That is evidence. It's not that you sat in your house and read a book and said, okay, any community that burns fire, the minute I introduce early waste collection, then it will change the practice. Some people might decide that, if they burn fire, it is service to their God. If you do the research, you will discover that. Then that is what will lead you to your intervention. So this is what I recommend. Simple practices that you do every day when you want to get your degree and graduate is what you bring back into the NGO world. Is what we do even anytime you want to make a decision, even at household level. You call your children, okay, what do you think? What do you think? It's the same thing. You're just expanding it to a larger number of people, a wide sample. You just have to now be very methodological because, then you have to make sure that the sample size is representative. You have to make sure that the sample group is representative, is diverse. If the community has different ethnic representations, you make sure your sample group has those different, all those identities must be reflected within your sample group, things like that. Those where you now begin to follow the rules of methods and research, right? But the principle is the same. Ask, you shall hear. When you hear, you design.
Powerful, powerful. I just love how you simplify that. Research is basically stepping out into the communities and asking the right set of questions. And they call it extracting, eliciting the answers from the beneficiaries themselves, those who are impacted by the problems you're trying to solve, and not basing your design on assumptions and opinions. Thank you so much, Barrister Idem. So quickly, I want us to take Amanda's question. She's dropped a question in the comment section. She says, "Would love Edem's explanation of theory of change. Can be difficult to identify and articulate, particularly with new initiatives in this space, when impact may be abstract or dependent on externals."
Can be difficult to identify and articulate, particularly with new initiatives in this space when impact may be abstract or dependent on externals.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, theory of change is a whole workshop. I'm looking at how to at least basically your theory of change is saying if I add 1 to 1, it will equal 2. You're basically saying it's an assumption, right? It's a guess. It's a theory. As we know, theories are hazards. You're hazarding a guess, right? So you experiment. I always tell people the very existence of your nonprofit is a theory. You're saying that, oh, my mission statement, this your mission statement is a theory. You're saying that if I provide young people with services, whether counseling services or blah, 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 through an organization or through youth centers that are accessible and within proximity to them, they are less likely to get involved in juvenile delinquency behavior, right? Then you go and build a whole organization around that mission. You still must recognize that it's a theory. So you must be, that thing that you've already built, you have a board, you've registered with CAC, you set out your objectives, it's a theory. And which means, like any theory, it must be subject to proof. So every year your report is further proof or disproof of your theory. Every time you do an intervention, it is either proving that the theory indeed works or it is disproving that the theory works. That's the first thing. So for you to come up with a theory, you have to operate based on evidence, especially when you're going to go and put all your resources, your savings, and go to fundraisers and gather all their money. Your organization is built on a theory. Your individual projects and programs run by your organization is built on theories. There are always subsets of theories of change. And that's, I think, the point Amanda is making when she talks about a lot of things are subject to external, influences. Sometimes you have to recognize when your theory no longer works. Sometimes your theory did work, but maybe the conditions have shifted. Maybe it has turned out that the influence of the internet is the greater, contributor or factor driving certain behaviors in young people as opposed to maybe lack of youth centers. So it's not about youth center anymore. Maybe the proper theory should be, how do we properly, educate young people on safe cyber use or safe use of the internet, because that is the greater threat to their overall development, right? So that's why, again, you must recognize that even though you've gone and put in millions of resources, every year you're subject, your NGO, your existence, your mission is subject to further, test. So you never go to sleep. Even though CAC doesn't come back and tell you that your organization's mission is not relevant anymore, you yourself, you have to keep understanding that yearly you're subject to disproof or proof of the relevance of your theory. And you must accept and acknowledge when that theory is no longer working. That's why sometimes organizations shut down programs. That's why it's not just always because of funding. Sometimes it's because that's no longer the best way to arrive at the outcome you want to arrive at. Maybe a better approach would be internet-based services that teach young people internet literacy, cyber security, cyber safety, as opposed to maybe a program on the radio that has been educating them on their maybe, what do you call it, puberty, when they, things like that. The old school, where what we used to do before, you have one
Yeah.
Auntie Jemima that will come on the radio and be answering their questions. Not to say that
Yeah.
those things were not working, but maybe that's not the theory anymore.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I feel like we could have a whole conversation on Amanda's question. I probably haven't
Yes.
even taught the whole thing. But the
Yeah.
point is, your theory is, as any other scientific theory, it's not cast in stone. It's
Mm.
saying, if I do these set of things based on the existing conditions, this will be the equal, it will amount to these kinds of outcomes. And so every year, or every, whatever your own timing, how you measure your timing. For some people, maybe it's quarterly, you review your theory. For some people, maybe it's yearly. For some people, maybe it's every 2 years. Your strategy document, your organizational strategy document is published every 2 years. You have to review your theory of change. And you must recognize that it's subject to external change, because the world is shifting. Like I said, the landscape of education and development is very different 10 years today than it was 10 years ago when I started. Things have
Yes.
shifted radically.
Powerful. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. I just love again how you simplified the theory of change definition and explanation. That everything we basically do is hinge on a theory, and you must continually validate that, okay, this theory of change, continually prove that this theory of change truly, is working. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. So I want to take a question from our community, one of the curated questions, and then we will tie up this powerful and very insightful webinar and time that we've had with you, Barrister Edem. So, and it goes first. As an American nonprofit, how can I begin to partner with those on the continent to help with efforts that share the same objectives to make a global impact?
And this is a major challenge for many people, in diaspora, who want to partner actively on the ground with local NGOs, but they either are afraid. There's been a lot of, they've had bad experiences, or they've heard of bad experiences, or just maybe even if it's not about fear, they just simply can't, zoom in on who to work with. Again, just like I would do my gatekeeper analysis, I recommend that those kinds of nonprofits do their gatekeeper analysis. And if I want to go into a community, it's like if you're a stranger in any society or any place, there are some places, maybe because we're raised in Africa, we're trained to be very security conscious. For instance, if I go to a new place, I won't just ask any random person on the street for directions, right? I will look for maybe a uniformed police officer, or I'll look for a very public place, and maybe a market woman selling in a very public place. There are certain strategic people you will look out for, who you consider guides. I think for me, even in the context of her question, that analogy works. Who is a useful guide, right? Sometimes it might mean going to your embassy in that country to say, do you have a database of nonprofits working in these specific areas? Sometimes maybe you feel like your embassy is too elitist and might be working only with very accomplished, people who are connected to the ambassador, and you don't want that kind of, list, right? Maybe you then begin to, this is the era of the internet, where a lot of people, power has been decentralized, or access, that kind of thing. Find communities of practice. Every day you're hearing, oh, Mandela Washington Fellowship, oh, Yali. You hear some of those things, oh, Hubert Humphrey, oh, Fulbright this. You hear some of those names, and forgive me that I'm calling a lot of American-based programs, but the Germans have theirs, the French have theirs, right? So depending on what country you come from, begin to look for alumni from these places. Sometimes you can even go to your, university or institution where you graduated from, and contact the alumni there. I just know I'm a very resourceful person, so I know how to search. If I want to search for something, I will zoom in, and I will know how I'll conduct my search. I think that principle for me is what will help. Leverage. Remember, we talked about leveraging your existing networks. Sometimes it
Yes.
might mean you even going to a meeting with your nonprofits in whatever state you are in the US and saying, has anybody ever worked in West Africa, specifically maybe Nigeria? Can you give me any list of contacts to, reach out to in these specific domains, education, health, blah, blah, blah. That's the first step. You can reach out to your career office when you were in the university or in graduate school and say, do you have a list of alumni? I want to reach out to alumni and message them to ask those who have gone back to their home countries. Can they recommend any NGOs working in education? So just leverage all your networks. Leverage all your networks. The most important thing, you want to get to the most credible nonprofit, right? So be very careful who your gatekeeper is or your guide. Your guide should also be credible. And make sure your guide is also not trapped in an elite system, because in the developing world, I tell you, there might be effective NGOs, but they're only reaching already empowered people. But if you want to reach people at the grassroots, you need to also maybe break through your comfort zone a little bit to get to those who are not working with the empowered people. And they're not typically, I won't call names, but they're not in some grand meetings, they're not in some grand meetings, right? But they're reaching the grassroots you want to reach. So maybe leverage your existing networks, ask people, reach out to alumni groups you've ever belonged in, send cold emails out to executives, check websites, executives of all these, associations of exchange programs who maybe were connected to your country. If you're from France, check the ones who were part of exchange programs in your country, France. If you're from the US, similar things, and you're getting closer and closer to the people you want to reach.
Powerful. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem, for those very insightful nuggets. Again, just emphasizing the power of leveraging existing communities, support systems. Just as you said, leveraging either your career office and etc. within the country country where you're currently based, or even the country that you're targeting to make impact in. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. So quickly, I want us to take this penultimate question. Then we'll move on to we'll tie this up neatly and move on to our final question. So again, this is another question from one of our community members, which goes first. It says, as an individual with passion for social development, but however limited by resources, how do I start making an impact with little or no resources? And then someone else is asking a question around, what are the chances of survival within the Nigerian social sector due to the attitudes of the government and the people to the sector? I know there are like two different questions, but I just want you to nicely just answer that for us.
The first one is talking about basically launching out with very
Yes.
constrained, resources. I didn't, like I said, when I set out, I operated from a lot of naivety. The first thing is, wanting to do good is not enough, and hope is not a strategy. So you do have to develop your strategic plan. If you have, evidence that this thing you want to do is relevant, it is valuable, it is needed, and it is timely, then you should find the people who also connect with that truth. Sometimes the impact of this problem is affecting people. Remember, if you saw the point where I talked about those brainstorming questions, who is affected by the problem? Sometimes the fact of unemployment is not only affecting the unemployed. Sometimes the companies that are there who want to hire but cannot find employable people will be very happy to sponsor your nonprofit to do an employability program, just because they themselves are stranded. They can't find people who fit the bill. So, you don't have to be the one with the money. In fact, many businessmen will tell you that if you're the only person funding your idea, it's not a viable idea, right? The market doesn't appreciate it. It's the same principle, even the nonprofit space. We're not trading in a product or a service. What we're trading in is value. We're telling people this thing is of development value. It improves the conditions of lives, and this is the implication for you and I. As a business, your business can operate in a more, safe environment, and your investments can be protected or safe. They're less likely to face destruction or whatever. So once you can communicate those things, those value to the people who are affected, the stakeholders, then you're likely to cash in. You can convert that value into cash. So for me, it's about going back to the drawing board. And I always tell people, don't rush and start that NGO. Don't rush and start that project. Sit down and spend the 90% of the effort first in developing the blueprint. If you think through the process first, you would have planned even your fundraising strategy before you launch out. The 10% of your effort is just executing what you've designed in that blueprint. So for anybody who says, oh, I don't have the money, but I have an idea, then sit down, just like anybody who wants to do a business. Sometimes we get off easier in nonprofit world because we don't go and pitch to investors. If we're pitching to investors, we'll be more, we'll take more time. Because those young entrepreneurs who want to pitch to investors, they spend time doing their business model canvas. They come up, they calculate it well. They even tell you, to the extent they'll tell you who their competitor is and their business, their own, wonderful value proposition. They'll tell you why they have an edge over every other person. We don't do those things in the non-profit space. You just jump. I want to do good. Bish, you've gone. You've moved. That has to stop. So the second question is how do I remain sustainable when I don't, basically the environment isn't designed to help me. Policymakers are
Exactly.
and all that. I still connect it to the strategy question. I still connect because and there was a way she framed the question. How likely, or I think it was, how likely am I to
Yes. So, what are
use,
chances of
what
NGO
are the
or a
chances?
social enterprise surviving
Yeah,
Nigeria's social sector due to the attitudes of the government and the people
yeah.
into the
So
sector?
of course I like questions like that because the chances are as good as the evidence of those who have survived. You
I
understand?
love this.
So for every organization that has survived, not by any patronage, not by connection to corridors of power and getting money, without defending the merit of their idea, but every day they are hosting to get across the message and people believe them and they can raise money, donations, grants on the basis of the merit of what they're proposing. That's the evidence you need that it is possible to survive no matter the hostile environment. Look, I started my NGO activities 10 years ago. I started it completely naive. I had to cross over from, passion project, idealistic person to organizational manager, right? But as you build those competencies, you keep weathering the difficult storms. And 10 years, I'm here. I'm here, even though I've never gotten a grant from, a policymaker. The people we say, are standing against us, right? There are other people standing by to support you based on the value proposition you're offering. So I think the most important thing is sit down with your strategy document, plot your graph, plot your graph, plot your graph. Not to say that having plotted it makes it easier, but you're moving with clarity,
Yes,
singularity of purpose and clarity. You're less likely
it's
to be
very true.
meandering and wasting energy on, futile pursuits. So I still recommend the same advice I gave to the first person to also this particular question. My existence is all the evidence that you can succeed.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. Just let me ride upon that. Even our existence as an organization, that's Ideation of Africa, is also proof to you that this is possible, that you can survive, and there are many other NGOs, CSOs, social enterprises doing amazing work, which also proves that you can also, navigate, not just survive, but thrive and make that very extensive impact across the globe. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem.
Sorry,
I
Tony.
want
I don't know
you,
if you. Okay, sorry. I hope you don't mind. I was just going to add another anecdote to the first question.
yes,
The
please.
person who
It's
asked
fine.
about lack
Yes,
of
please.
resources. I remember when I started, I didn't have an office. So I started with my car. The car that I got from my place of work. They bought me a car. That's what I used to start my mobile library interventions. Right. I
Wow.
remember I went for a program, a non-profit a conference or something, and one of my mentors, my older mentors, stood up and said, "Anybody that does not have an office, a credible address, is a go-to address that can be identified, is not credible. Simple." And I remember that day I stood up very politely and I said, "No, I've got to invalidate that. That's not true." A lot of the people in the social impact space is changing radically.
Yes.
In the previous years, a lot of people got institutional grants. That meant that they could set up an institution, right? They could hire, they could rent, they could furnish an office. This space we're going in, a lot of young people are coming in addressing a problem in the community. So they're coming in more programmatic than administrative. They don't have administrative structure, but they have a program defined and clear, very clearly spelled out and a work plan built. You now have to help them move from project to structure. That has to be
Love
the
it.
focus, as opposed to just, discrediting. No, because you must
Yes.
observe the dispensations. Too many young people who are dissatisfied with the problems and challenges in their environment, they want to act, but they don't have those huge resources that involve setting up an office. But they have
Very
the
true.
energy to act, the commitment to act. Will we throw away those assets? How do we harness that and then move
Very
them
true.
into that system and structure we need to see, because they've got to move to that point, right? So don't
Yes.
despair that you have very limited resources. You can start small, but most importantly, structure that project around these questions. Make sure that what you're bringing into your community is something the community fully embraces. If it is something the community fully embraces, they might even be willing to pay for it, even if it's
Yes.
a little. And as long as you're not making it for profit, whatever you earn from that, you're deploying it right back. Then you
Yeah.
have a social enterprise on your hand.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. It is indeed, it is indeed it has been a very awesome, brilliant, insightful, impacting webinar with you. You've really doled out, unraveled your wisdom with us tonight, and we don't take this for granted in any way. We're indeed very grateful to have you on our platform tonight. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. So I just wanted to, in a final round of this webinar, I wanted to share your final words with us. What advice and recommendations would you offer nonprofits and social entrepreneurs who want to scale their advocacy strategies to a new global level for greater impact?
Okay, so I think three things I'll just finally end with, because these are things that I constantly remind myself about. One, your idea is relevant, and as simple as it is, it really can transform your community, it can transform lives, and so it's worth pursuing. Sometimes you have to really strengthen your validation system. Your idea is relevant, it can transform lives in your community, it can transform your community, it is worth pursuing. I repeat that. So even though the events around you are overwhelming, the problems are huge, don't worry. That small thing you are addressing is solving the problems of some households. It is worth pursuing. Secondly, please don't work alone. Find a community of practice, a community of like minds. This journey you've undertaken, you can't afford to go on it lonely. You can't afford to. There are too many difficulties in your path that require you to have a support system. And not only is this support system to, encourage you when you're down, but it's supposed to plug you into relevant information, tell you when
Yes.
there are opportunities you need to access, funding opportunities, training opportunities, staffing opportunities, opportunities that move you from point A to point B. So don't walk alone. It's very critical. And finally, I'd like to say to you, it's a theory. Keep revalidating it, keep checking it, keep checking it. Is it still relevant? And be willing and able and ready to pivot when the times before you, the realities before you are telling you that this thing is no longer the way to go. Not that you shouldn't still do impact work. Maybe you need to re strategize and revisit the theory. Maybe a new approach is welcome at that point in time. Never be afraid to embrace change. Never be afraid to embrace change. Otherwise, we're just as guilty as those people in those communities we are approaching to change their mindsets because they refused to adapt to changing times.
Yes. Wow,
That's it.
powerful. Thank you so much, Barrister Adam. I really love how you emphasize the power of community, and that's why we do what we do at Ideation of Africa. That's why we curate this webinar every month, so that we're bringing in very invaluable resources to members of our community, which are change makers and social innovators alike. And just as you rightly said, from time to time, we share a lot of resources with our community members by email, you know, into funding opportunities, ongoing work opportunities, ongoing collaborative opportunities. And I just love how you emphasize that in rounding off tonight. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem Ossai. Um, if you would love to connect with Barrister Edem Ossai, please just tell us how our audience and our community members can connect with you if they would love to do that.
Please just check my names on LinkedIn, Edem Ossai or Edem Dorothy Ossai, but Edem Ossai is fine. You'll find me on LinkedIn. You can shoot me an email. I'm open to that as well. It's kokoanda@gmail.com, and it's spelled KOKOANDAH@gmail.com. KOKOANDAH@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter, Coco Anda, KOKOANDAH. Follow me on Instagram, Coco Anda, KOKOANDAH. I check all of these sites very actively. So if you shoot me a DM in any of these places, you'd probably get a response.
Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. So, just before we round up tonight, I want to leverage on the point of joining a community, and that's why I would just, in brief, just a few seconds, again emphasize the major need, the critical need, why you must join the Social Innovation School. We have curated lots of very great resources at very, very affordable rates. The whole essence of placing a price to it is not just for the sake of just making money, but it's for us to be able to expand our impact to more regions and to also be able to collaborate and reach out to change makers and social innovators within our community. So we encourage you to please, come on board, enroll into the Social Innovation School today. The link is scrolling through the screen at the moment, and I just want you to do the needful. I know that a team member will also share the link in the comment section, and you can click on it and do the needful as well. And of course, if you are a funder or an investor who is seeking, or even someone, an individual, a change maker, a social innovator, seeking opportunities to make an impact, to really reach and also contribute towards the successful evolution of other social innovators. We encourage you to partner with us. You can also crowdsource, crowdfund. You can also sponsor more change makers to come on board the Social Innovation School. And you can definitely hit us or reach us via our email, which is info@ideationofafrica.org, if you would love to sponsor rather, or partner with us in this direction. Thank you so much. Exactly. Also connect with us across our various social media platforms. Connect with Barrister Edem Ossai across our different platforms: LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. If you visit our IG and our Instagram handle, you should be able to point to Barrister Edem's handle from some of our posts. We recognized her recently as one of our African female change makers. She's one of the amazing women doing phenomenal work and making that sustainable impact within the continent. And we really do appreciate you. And we're really saying to you that we're truly inspired by what you do. And yes, keep the fire burning. Thank you so much, Barrister Eda. So, without further ado, we'll be calling it a night. Thank you to our amazing audience. Thank you to our amazing community members. Thank you to all participants who have joined in tonight. I can see Kende, I can see Amanda, I can see Uluwatosin. I can connect to list out so many names, and I can see Kende cheering Barrister Edem. You're saying, go Edie, go Edie. We appreciate that. Thank you for coming on board tonight as well. And to every other person who has joined us tonight from anywhere across the world, we truly appreciate you joining us tonight. And of course, do not let it stop here. Plug into our various communities. We have a Telegram channel, we have our social media platforms, we have our email community. We have very vibrant communities that you can be a part of. And of course, finally, again, enroll into the Social Innovation School. Once again, we extend our very heartfelt gratitude to Barrister Edem for making it a very insightful session tonight, and making it for honoring our invitation and making it a worthwhile event, not just event, a worthwhile session for everyone. Thank you so much, Barrister Edem. And to our amazing community, good night. Thank you. And we look forward to you joining us at the next webinar in April. And of course, we have a very insightful topic we'll be tweeting in April, and you will definitely see our publicity materials, across our different platforms speaking to that soon. Thank you so much, and do enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, Tony. Good night, everyone.
Good night.